Africa. The countries of the African continent are often associated with poverty, hunger, and underdevelopment. Even relatively prosperous countries like Equatorial Guinea or Gabon do not change the overall picture. Why are most African countries so poor? Why is Africa not developing? And how can we understand Africa? And what is lacking for deeper perception? You have probably heard many answers to these questions. Colonial history, geographical location, and climate are factors that have influenced Africa's development, but they are not the main reasons for the underdevelopment of the most African countries. So today, let's talk about Africa. In late July 2023, the Russia-Africa Summit took place in St. Petersburg. Heads of all African states were invited to the summit. However, only 17 of them agreed to attend, which is less than a third from the total number. The rest sent less representative delegations, and 9 countries completely ignored Russia's invitation. This dealt a serious blow to Vladimir Putin's ambitions personally. The summit's program was evidently crafted according to his whims. African officials were offered to discuss the Friendship Games as an alternative to the Olympics, talk about Russophobia, the illegality of sanctions, traditional values, and new colonialism. However, Putin encountered a cold reception. The leaders of leading African nations reminded the dictator of the grain deal with Ukraine and stated that it must continue. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa directly declared that they didn't came for gifts. The Black Sea must be open to global markets. This phrase sounded like a verdict to Russian leaders. Putin's cynicism is striking. He stars Africans by destroying grain in Ukrainian ports and promises them free Russian grain at the summit. 6 countries will receive 50,000 tons of grain each. This still won't solve the food problems. But if Russia hadn't excited the grain deal, African countries could continue to procure grain at affordable prices. Moreover, a significant event occurred one day before the summit's opening. An armed coup took place in Niger. The country ranks low on the United Nations Human Development Index and constantly suffers from Islamist insurgencies and military coups. This marks the 5th coup since Niger gained independence from France. On July 26 of 2023, the military detains the country's president Mohamed Bazoum, declared the closure of borders, the suspension of state institutions, and appointed the head of the Presidential Guard as the head of the transitional government. Supporters of the military organized rallies in their favor. Some people carried Russian flags and chanted the name of the Russian president. Before the coup, Niger's image in the West was improving. In March 2023, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the country and hailed it as an outstanding model of democracy in Africa. The United States invested $500 million in Niger's armed forces, which counter militant organizations affiliated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Currently, the US is concerned that the private military company Wagner might take advantage of the instability in Niger. There's information that the coup leaders reached out to them for assistance, and the head of the mercenaries, Yevgeny Prigozhin, welcomes the state coup. It seems that Russia plans to turn Niger into another battleground against the West, and this is a very dangerous trend. But first, let's delve a little deeper into the continent's history. Everyone knows about the existence of the great ancient Egyptian civilization that emerged in Africa along the banks of the Nile. Other civilizations also arose near major rivers. For example, the ancient kingdom of Aksum, located in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, is mentioned in the Bible. It was known for its gold mines and monumental obelisks that have survived to these days. So why didn't civilization spread further into the depth of the continent? The answer is obvious: the desert. In those times, cultural and economic exchange was impossible across vast desert regions. However, this doesn't mean that progress stopped in the areas south of the Sahara. During the Middle Ages, dozens of states emerged on the continent, many of which were quite remarkable. For instance, the Mali Empire that emerged in the 13th century, it established trade with the Muslim East, supplying salt and gold. In the 14th century, Mali's ruler, Mansa Musa, amazed the entire world. He embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca with an enormous caravan loaded with gold and precious gems. Along the way, the ruler distributed wealth, causing a temporary devaluation of gold throughout the entire Middle East. It's interesting, experts from the publication Celebrity Net Worth estimated Mansa Musa's wealth at $400 billion in today's terms. In the ranking of the richest people of all time in 2012, he stood at 25th place, surpassing the Rothschilds and Rockefellers. After the decline and fall of the Mali Empire, strong states emerged in Africa that traded with Arabs, Indians, and even China. From an economic development standpoint, African countries did not differ much from their European counterparts of the time. The notion of Africa's lack in civilization today is greatly exaggerated. At certain stages of history, Africans not only did not lag behind, but even surpassed Europeans in their development. For example, Africa never had a Bronze Age. There simply wasn't the necessary material to produce bronze. Therefore, the inhabitants of Africa transitioned directly from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. So what went wrong? The problem was that African countries appeared on the world stage too late. Europe was already entering the era of early capitalism, with the growth of plantations in America and industrial development in Europe. The so-called triangular trade was organized. Cheap labor was needed for plantations and mines in the American colonies, and the resources obtained there were in demand in Europe. African countries, on the other hand, needed European industrial goods, primarily firearms. The only things African could offer in return were gold, ivory, and human labor, slaves. From the mid-16th century, the states of Central and West Africa became slave-owning empires that depended on the demands for slaves. This continued until the beginning of the 19th century, when European countries and subsequently the United States began to prohibit the slave trade and slavery. The decline in demand for the primary export commodity, slaves, led to a crisis in many African countries. Within a century, Africa found itself divided among European powers. In the second half of the 19th century, the process of colonizing Africa reached such a scale that it became known as the Scramble for Africa. By 1870, Western European states only controlled 10% of the African continent. By the beginning of the 20th century, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained independent. The entire continent was divided among European powers: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Italy. Spain and Portugal retained their old colonies. The Russian Empire, was not invited to participate in the division of Africa. A small spoiler, Russia will embark on its own form of colonization of the continent in 100 years. But more on this later. Harsh exploitating regimes were established in African colonies. Let's take the example of the Congo. Belgian King Leopold II created the Congo Free State as his personal colony. However, it was only free for entrepreneurs who could invest in plantations and exploit the local population for rubber extraction. Those who were deemed unproductive had their limbs severed. The colonial regime in the Congo was so brutal that the population decreased from 30 million to 15 million in just 40 years. Africa was primarily exploited for the extraction of resources and minerals. The infrastructure served solely the interests of the colonizers. Roads were built only to the resource extraction sites and the nearest ports. No hospitals or schools were constructed for the local population. Healthcare and education were provided by Christian missionaries or private charitable organizations. The question of decolonization in Africa arose after World War II. Many Africans fought on the side of the anti-Hitler coalition and desired the liberation of their people. The influence of public opinion in Europe and the United States played a significant role. In the 1950s and 1960s, the majority of African states gained independence. In many countries, these processes occurred peacefully. However, some nations had to fight for their independence. The war in Algeria ended with France recognizing its independence. Portugal waged war against rebels in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. The process of decolonization was finally completed in 1990 with the liberation of Namibia from South African rule. During the period of gaining independence, many countries changed their names to reflect their African identity. It would seem that these newly liberated countries had everything necessary for further growth, established ties with the former colonial powers and infrastructure for extractive industries. However, there were significant challenges. The countries were created along former colonial borders, which didn't consider ethnic, linguistic, or religious affiliations of the population. This contributed to internal and external conflicts. Another important factor was the lack of education amidst a demographic boom. With a predominantly illiterate population, rapid economic growth was unattainable. Such a population was limited to unskilled physical labor, perpetuating the division between a literate majority and a literate minority. What did African countries engage in after liberation? In essence, they continued what they were doing during colonial oppression, providing cheap resources to their former colonial powers and maintaining stability in the existing system. So how does the situation stand now? And why is Africa still not developing? Surprisingly, the first cause of Africa's poverty is its natural resources. In general, 1/3 of the world's resources are found in Africa. Due to these enormous natural resources, the primary sector of Africa's economy remains the extraction of raw materials. A significant portion of African countries' revenue comes from exporting raw materials. It is evidence that there are no prospects for development in such an economy. It turns out to be a paradox. The presence of natural resources in African countries has led them to become entirely dependent on the sale of raw materials. It may provide some income, but it is insufficient to foster meaningful development. In conditions where a limited number of individuals in power have access to the main source of country's revenue, corruption will inevitably flourish. This economic model leads to a situation where policies serve not the citizens but the interests of business. This cross of business and politics enriches a small elite, while the living standards of ordinary people and the country's economy just fall down. Another less visible aspect is the capital flights from African countries. Money obtained from resource sales is taken out of the country, stored and spent elsewhere. According to experts, estimates up to 70% of Africa's capital is located outside the continent, held in banks in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Incompetence and a lack of financial discipline are prevalent in most African countries. This is actively exploited by large and influential nations such as China. China generously provides loans and finances infrastructure projects in Africa. Chinese traders have achieved in Africa what neither Western colonizers nor Soviet enlighteners could. The volume of China's trade with African countries exceeds $200 billion per year. China is the main supplier of goods to Africa and the primary buyer of local raw materials. For example, almost the entire furniture industry in China operates on timber from Nigeria, Cameroon, Mozambique, and Namibia. In 2018, at the China-Africa Cooperation Forum, Xi Jinping announced that China would provide $60 billion in investments, loans, and grants to African countries in the coming years. The Chinese have penetrated almost all sectors of the African economy, including resource extraction, infrastructure, and agriculture. In certain sectors, such as construction, Chinese companies hold a 50% market share. This is also an active influence on higher education in Africa. The Chinese National Office for Teaching Chinese Language has established 60 Confucius Institutes there to promote the Chinese language and culture. Several African countries have already introduced Chinese language instruction in primary school curricula. Unlike Europeans who prioritize adherence to the law, the Chinese are willing to tolerate corrupt practices in African countries. Additionally, dozens of African countries have enormous debts to China. For example, Ethiopia currently owes China $14 billion, while Angola has the largest debt to Asian giants, amounting to $43 billion. China has also acquired the entire mining industry of Zimbabwe. It is claimed that China acts in a tough manner. If a country is unable to repair its debt, China does not provide repayments or restructuring. Instead, they simply take over infrastructure. However, the authorities often have no choice. China comes to Africa with money. Once upon a time, a Soviet Union acted as a benefactor and generously provided loans. However, the Soviet Union collapsed, never recovering its money, and most of the loans to African nations were simply forgiven. Therefore, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Africa turned its gaze to China. And indeed, the Asian giants came to the rescue. Modern highways, bridges, and airports have appeared in some of the poorest places on the planet. The construction of roads, railways, power plants, and oil refineries by Chinese firms has had a positive impact on local economic development. Russia, another country with an authoritarian regime, and also has interests in Africa. Its influence on the continent dates back to the days of the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Soviet Union saw Africa as a battleground for competition with the United States. The Soviet Union invested significant resources in supporting and expanding socialist-oriented countries. Russia has always had a high level of xenophobia, including racial prejudice. However, today, instead of the West, which granted independence to African countries, Russia is colonizing the continent. It does so through military advisors and private military companies, leveraging its Soviet-era relationships with African nations to establish its sphere of influence. The private military company Wagner has been terrorizing the population of African countries for several years now. By 2022, the presence and influence of Wagner had spread to at least 25 countries on the continent. Individuals associated with the company's leader, Evgeny Prigozhin, offered consultations to local politicians in exchange for a share in natural resource extraction. Wagner mercenaries provide military support and protect strategic assets. Western countries and the United Nations accuse Wagner of destabilizing Africa. Here are just a few examples. Russian private military campaigns, including Wagner, participated in the civil war in Sudan on the side of Omar al-Bashir, a close ally of Putin, who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court in Hague. Russian mercenaries in Libya used banned anti-personnel mines during the conflict. According to Human Rights Watch, Wagner's personnel in Mali have been involved in mass killing and looting of the local population. In 2022, Wagner contributed to a military coup in Burkina Faso. In Guinea, Russian consultants helped President Alpha Condé, who is loyal to Moscow, extend his term and secure re-election. In 2018, Russian military and civilian advisors were deployed to the country, along with mercenaries from the private military company of Evgeny Prigozhin. Many journalists and investigators claim that the Russians have essentially taken over the Central African Republic. They have replaced the regular army, guard the borders, and protect places of valuable resource extraction. Human Rights Watch has published a report stating that Russian mercenaries extensively engage in mass killing, torture, abductions, looting, and sexual violence in the country. So alongside China, there is an unnoticed Russian colonization of Africa. However, while China acts through economic measures, Russia skillfully combines financial support with military presence. And another significant point: after the attack on Ukraine, Russia found itself in political and diplomatic isolation. The president of Russia became an outcast. African leaders are filling the void created around Putin. Naturally, this narrative works exclusively for domestic Russian audience. Additionally, both China and Russia take advantage of the poverty and high levels of corruption in African countries for their political interests. It shouldn't be forgotten that each country has one vote in the United Nations, and there are over 50 countries in Africa. This often becomes a subject of bargaining. Powerful nations buy the votes of poor African states for relatively small amounts of money, pushing through favorable decisions on the international stage. Sometimes they don't even have to pay. African countries owe so much to China and Russia that they can simply be strongly urged with a hint of this debt to support their interests. For example, during the early stages of the Russian aggression, when the Ukraine issue was being discussed at the United Nations, African delegations abstained from voting. In Russian propaganda, this was always portrayed as a diplomatic victory. In reality, the majority of African countries either took a neutral or pro-Russian position once the conflict started. Only intensified efforts by Western countries gradually lead to a change in sentiment. In October 2022, several African countries supported a resolution condemning Russia as an aggressor for the first time. Ukrainian diplomacy also works with African countries. In June 2022, President Zelensky addressed the African Union through a video conference. A year later, in June 2023, delegations from 7 African countries visited Kiev. The situation is such that the African continent has suffered significantly as a result of the war in Ukraine, primarily due to restrictions on exporting Ukrainian food and fertilizer. The echoes of anti-Russian sanctions, which hindered the delivery of goods from Russia, also affected the continent. The stable renewal of the so-called grain deal hangs by a thread each time, and Moscow has to be compelled to agree to it. Therefore, African leaders, more than anyone else, are interested in a swift end to the war. Against this backdrop, Ukraine hopes to initiate new relationships with African countries, which have developed relatively slowly in recent decades. At the beginning of 2023, Zelensky also announced that within a year, Kiev would expand its presence in Africa by opening 10 new embassies. Russia, on the other hand, demands that Africa choose between it and the West in exchange for its reliable partnership. However, in the current geopolitical and trade realities, this cannot satisfy the majority of African countries. Western countries also pay attention to the African continent in an attempt to atone for their centuries-old guilt towards Africa. Western democracies invest money in infrastructure projects and provide economic aid to poor countries. At the G7 summit in 2022, the leaders of major countries once again announced their economic support for African countries. The president of South Africa and the chairperson of the African Union were invited to the summit. Against the backdrop of escalating tensions between the West and Russia and China, new problems and challenges rise for African leaders. Western countries are able to offer Africa an alternative. However, this requires a reciprocal process, and African countries are asked to implement reforms, uphold human rights and economic freedoms, increase democratization, and fight corruption in return. It is precisely these efforts that can bring stability and development to the African continent in the future. And the most important thing is for Africa not to become a global theater of conflict between these parties. African and Western peoples should not become pawns in the games of politicians. Africa is a mysterious and beautiful land with a fascinating history, diverse traditions and beliefs. However, a complex set of factors from climate and colonial past to the modern expansion of major powers prevents African countries from being on par with the world's largest nations. Corruption, lack of reforms, and democratic institutions also play a role in underdevelopment. Despite these challenges, Africa holds the potential for growth and future prosperity. Today, African countries find themselves at a crossroads between the West, China, and Russia. Yet African people should not become hostages to political games and global conflicts. Africa needs peace and sustainable development. Africa is a land of possibilities, and its future depends on how the rest of the world understands and supports its aspiration for development and prosperity.